The crimson sun dipped low behind the jagged mountains as Fiona Whitley stepped off the stagecoach, dust swirling around her ankles in the dry Missouri air. Independence was nothing like Boston, rough-hewn and untamed, a stark contrast to the sophisticated city she'd left behind. The year was 1875, and she'd come west with nothing but a small trunk of belongings and a desperate hope for a new beginning. "Last stop, Independence," the driver called, tossing down her trunk with little ceremony. "Watch yourself, miss. Town ain't always kind to newcomers." Fiona straightened her travel-worn dress and lifted her chin. At 23, she'd already weathered enough hardship to know that kindness was rarely offered freely. The death of her parents had left her with few options back east, a teaching position that barely paid enough to survive, or marriage to her father's business partner, a man 30 years her senior with wandering hands and a cold heart. She'd chosen a third option instead, answering an advertisement from the Independence Frontier Gazette seeking educated women to serve as teachers in the expanding Western Territories. The main street stretched before her, lined with saloons, a general store, and what appeared to be a small hotel. Horses were hitched to posts, and men in dusty clothes moved with purpose. A few women in plain dresses hurried along, baskets in hand. This would be her home now. "You must be the new school teacher," a voice called from behind her. Fiona turned to find an older woman with silver-streaked hair pulled into a severe bun. "Yes, madam, Fiona Whitley. Margaret Turner. I run the boarding house where you'll be staying." The woman's eyes were sharp but not unkind as she assessed Fiona. "It's not much, but it's clean and safe. The school's expecting you tomorrow morning." As they walked, Margaret pointed out the essential landmarks of Independence: the church, the sheriff's office, the mercantile. "Most important place to know is Sawyer's General Store. Henry Lawson owns it. Anything you need, he can get it or tell you who can." The name meant nothing to Fiona then, but she nodded politely as they approached a modest 2-story building with a small sign reading Turner's Boarding House. "Supper's at 6, Margaret informed her. "You'll meet the other boarders then." Fiona's room was small but tidy, with a narrow bed, a dresser, and a small desk beneath the window. She unpacked her few belongings, carefully arranging her books on the desk. The final item she withdrew from her trunk was a daguerreotype of her parents, taken just before her father's business had failed and their lives had unraveled. She placed it gently beside her bed. When the dinner bell rang, Fiona made her way downstairs to find 4 other boarders already seated. Margaret made quick introductions: 2 older men who worked at the bank, a young woman who served as the telegraph operator, and Mrs. Winters, a widow who worked as the town's seamstress. "The schoolteacher position has been vacant since spring," Mrs. Winters explained as they ate. "The children have been running wild. You'll have your hands full." "I'm prepared for the challenge," Fiona replied, though her confidence wavered as the others exchanged knowing glances. After dinner, Fiona decided to familiarize herself with the town before darkness fell completely. The evening air was cooler, and she walked slowly, observing the people of Independence as they went about their business. A group of men exited a saloon, laughing raucously. A couple walked arm in arm from the church. 2 young boys chased each other through the street. She found herself outside Sawyer's General Store just as a tall man was locking the front door. He turned at her approach, and Fiona felt a curious flutter in her stomach. He wore no cowboy hat like many of the other men in town, but his demeanor, confident, self-assured, marked him unmistakably as a man of the frontier. "We're closed, madam," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "Open again at 7 tomorrow." "I'm not shopping," Fiona replied. "Just exploring." "I'm new to town." He studied her with interest, his eyes the color of aged whiskey. The schoolteacher. Word travels fast, she observed. Independence isn't Boston. Not much happens here that everyone doesn't know about by sundown. He extended his hand. Henry Lawson, this is my store. His hand was calloused but warm as it enveloped hers. Fiona Whitley. What brings you all the way from Boston to our little corner of Missouri, Miss Whitley? Adventure, she replied, the lie coming easily to her lips. She'd told it so many times during her journey that it almost felt like truth. And the opportunity to make a difference. He smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his serious face. Well, independence could use a bit of both. The children here deserve a proper education. A horse and rider thundered down the main street, interrupting their conversation. The rider pulled up sharply in front of them, his expression urgent. Henry, need your help. Thompson's boy is hurt bad, fell from the hayloft. Doc Jenkins is out at the Miller place delivering a baby. Henry nodded sharply. I'll get my kit. He turned to Fiona. Excuse me, Miss Whitley, duty calls. You're a doctor, she asked, surprised. Not officially, but I know enough to help when Doc Jenkins is elsewhere. He disappeared into the store, emerging moments later with a leather satchel. He mounted his horse in one fluid motion, tipping his head to her. Welcome to Independence, Miss Whitley. I expect we'll be seeing more of each other. As he rode away, Fiona felt strangely bereft. There was something about Henry Lawson that intrigued her, a complexity beneath his straightforward exterior. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Fiona dressed carefully in her best dress, a modest blue garment that had once belonged to her mother. Her hands trembled slightly as she pinned her hair into a neat bun. First impressions mattered, especially with children. The schoolhouse was a simple one-room building at the edge of town. When Fiona arrived, she found 17 children of various ages waiting outside, eyeing her with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Good morning, she said firmly. I'm Miss Whitley, your new teacher. A girl of about 12 stepped forward. Madam, the last teacher left after 2 weeks. Said we were unteachable. Fiona met the girl's challenging gaze. Then she wasn't much of a teacher, was she? I don't believe anyone is unteachable. This earned her a few tentative smiles. Fiona unlocked the schoolhouse door and ushered the children inside. The interior was dusty and disorganized, with books strewn about and writing slates in disarray. Our first lesson, Fiona announced, will be in responsibility and cooperation. Let's put our classroom in order. By midday, the schoolhouse was transformed. Desks were arranged neatly, books were organized on shelves, and the chalkboard gleamed. Fiona had assessed the children's various levels of education and was pleased to discover that, despite their lack of formal schooling in recent months, most had a solid foundation. At lunch, while the children ate in the schoolyard, Fiona was surprised by a visitor. Henry Lawson stood in the doorway, a small crate in his arms. Miss Whitley, he greeted her. I heard you've made quite an impression already. News travels fast, she observed with a smile. Mrs. Turner mentioned you didn't have time for breakfast. Thought you might be hungry. He set the crate on her desk, revealing an apple, some cheese, bread, and a jar of preserves. Fiona was genuinely touched. That's very kind of you, Mr. Lawson. Henry, he corrected. And it's practical, not kind. Can't have our new teacher fainting from hunger on her first day. As he turned to leave, Fiona called after him, How is Thompson's boy? Henry paused, something flickering across his expression. He'll recover. It was a close thing, though. You saved his life. He shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. Anyone would have done the same. Not anyone could have, Fiona countered. You have a gift. I have experience, he corrected. Too much of it during the war. Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving Fiona with more questions than answers about the enigmatic storekeeper. The weeks that followed fell into a pattern. Fiona taught during the day, gradually winning over even the most reluctant students. In the evenings, she often walked through town, sometimes stopping at the general store. Henry was invariably polite, but she sensed a guardedness about him that intrigued her. One evening, about a month after her arrival, Fiona was grading papers in her room when a commotion in the street drew her to the window. A group of men on horseback had arrived, their manner boisterous and threatening. From her vantage point, she watched as Henry stepped out of his store to confront them. Words were exchanged, too distant for her to hear, but the tension was palpable. Concerned, Fiona hurried downstairs and out into the street, where a small crowd had gathered. "What's happening?" she asked Mrs. Winters, who stood watching with arms crossed. "Callahan gang," the woman replied grimly. "They come through every few months, cause trouble. Henry usually handles them." "Shouldn't someone get the sheriff?" Mrs. Winters snorted. "Sheriff Davis, he's probably hiding in his office. Man's about as useful as a screen door on a submarine." As Fiona watched, one of the men dismounted and approached Henry, who stood his ground, expression calm but resolute. The man jabbed a finger into Henry's chest, and Henry responded by saying something that made the man's face flush with anger. Before things could escalate further, a shot rang out. Fiona jumped, but it was only Sheriff Davis firing into the air as he emerged from his office. "That's enough, Callahan," the sheriff called. "You and your boys move along. We don't want trouble here." The man, Callahan, sneered but eventually remounted his horse. As the gang rode away, he called back to Henry, "This ain't over, Lawson, not by a long shot." The crowd dispersed, but Fiona made her way to Henry's side. "Are you all right?" "Fine," he replied shortly, his expression still tense. "You shouldn't be out here, Miss Whitley. Those men are dangerous." "So I gathered. Who are they?" Henry sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Jake Callahan and his gang. They fancy themselves outlaws, though they're mostly just troublemakers. They've had a grudge against independence against me in particular for years." "Why you?" He hesitated, then said, "It's a long story and not a pleasant one. Maybe another time." His tone made it clear the subject was closed. Fiona wanted to press further but respected his boundaries. "Well, I'm glad you're unharmed. Thank you for your concern." His expression softened. "How are things at the school?" The abrupt change of subject was obvious, but Fiona allowed it. "Improving daily. The children are eager to learn when given the chance." They talked for a while longer, and for the first time, Henry seemed to truly relax in her presence. As they parted ways, Fiona felt a deepening curiosity about the man who clearly held so many secrets. The following Sunday, Fiona attended services at the local church, as had become her custom. After the service, many of the townsfolk gathered for a communal picnic on the church grounds. It was there that she first heard the rumors. "Looking for a wife, they say," whispered Mrs. Palmer to Mrs. Green, unaware that Fiona sat just behind them. "Placed an advertisement in newspapers back east. Henry Lawson, seeking a mail-order bride." Mrs. Green sounded skeptical. "After what happened with Catherine, it's been 5 years. Man can't mourn forever." Fiona shouldn't have been interested. It was none of her business, but she found herself straining to hear more. Before she could, however, the subject of their gossip appeared beside her. "Miss Whitley," Henry said, offering her a glass of lemonade. "Enjoying the picnic?" "Very much," she replied, accepting the drink. "Though I find the conversation nearly as refreshing as the lemonade." He raised an eyebrow. "Oh, people seem quite interested in your personal affairs." Henry's expression clouded. "Small towns run on gossip, Miss Whitley. You'll learn to ignore most of it." "Is it true?" The question slipped out before she could stop herself. Are you seeking a wife through correspondence? His jaw tightened. My personal affairs are my own business. Of course, Fiona said quickly, embarrassed by her boldness. I apologize for prying. After an awkward moment, Henry's expression softened. No, I'm sorry, that was unnecessarily harsh. He sighed. To answer your question, yes, I placed an advertisement some months ago, but I've since reconsidered the idea. Before Fiona could respond, they were interrupted by one of her students, young Timothy Jenkins, who wanted to show Henry a slingshot he'd made. The moment passed, but Fiona found herself oddly relieved by Henry's admission that he had reconsidered. As autumn deepened, Fiona settled more comfortably into life in independence. Her students were making remarkable progress, and she had begun to form genuine friendships with several of the townspeople. Henry remained something of an enigma, though their interactions had grown more frequent and less formal. One crisp October afternoon, Fiona was returning from a nature walk with her students when she spotted a commotion near the general store. As they drew closer, she saw Henry loading supplies into a wagon while Sheriff Davis and several men stood nearby, looking grim. Children, please continue back to the schoolhouse, Fiona instructed. James, you're in charge. I'll join you shortly. Once the children had moved on, Fiona approached the group. Is something wrong? Henry looked up, surprised to see her. Miss Whitley, nothing for you to worry about. Sheriff Davis was less reticent. Callahan gang hit the Thompson farm last night, stole livestock, burned a barn. Was anyone hurt? Fiona asked, alarmed. Mrs. Thompson got a nasty bump on the head, but she'll recover. Mr. Thompson and the hands were out searching for stray cattle when it happened. The sheriff spat into the dust. Cowards prey on women and children. We're taking supplies out to help them rebuild, Henry explained, securing a tarp over the wagon. And some men will stay to make sure the gang doesn't return. I want to help, Fiona said immediately. The Thompson children are my students. Henry shook his head. It's not safe. Callahan's men could still be in the area. All the more reason the children might need a familiar face, Fiona argued. Besides, I'm quite capable of handling myself, Mr. Lawson. The sheriff chuckled. She's got spirit, Henry. Might be good to have her along for the children's sake. Henry clearly wasn't pleased but nodded reluctantly. Be ready in 10 minutes, and bring warm clothing. We'll likely be there overnight. The Thompson farm was located about 15 miles outside of Independence. The journey took several hours, with Henry driving the wagon and Fiona seated beside him. 4 other men rode alongside as protection. You're very quiet, Fiona observed as they traveled. Are you still upset that I insisted on coming? Henry's hands tightened on the reins. I don't like putting anyone in danger, especially women, Fiona suggested. Especially people I care about, he corrected, his eyes remaining fixed on the road ahead. The simple statement sent a wave of warmth through Fiona. Tell me about the Thompsons, she said, changing the subject to safer ground. Good people. Frank Thompson came west after the war, built that farm from nothing. His wife Mary is one of the kindest souls you'll ever meet. They've had more than their share of hardship, but they've never lost faith. And their children are bright and hardworking, Fiona added, though Elizabeth struggles with her reading. Henry glanced at her, impressed. You really know your students. That's my job, she replied simply. When they arrived at the Thompson farm, Fiona was shocked by the destruction. The barn was a charred ruin, and the farmhouse had broken windows and a damaged door. Mary Thompson sat on the porch, a bandage around her head, her 3 children huddled close to her. The children brightened when they saw Fiona, running to greet her. As the men unloaded supplies and began assessing the damage, Fiona took charge of the children, settling them at a makeshift table to continue their lessons. It provided a welcome distraction from the chaos around them. Throughout the day, Fiona watched Henry as he worked tirelessly repairing windows, reinforcing the farmhouse door, organizing the other men to clear debris from the burned barn. He moved with purpose and authority, and despite his earlier statement about not being a doctor, he checked Mary Thompson's head wound with gentle competence. As evening approached, the immediate needs had been addressed. A temporary shelter had been constructed for the remaining livestock, and the farmhouse was secure once more. The men set up camp in the yard, building a fire for warmth in the October chill. Fiona helped Mary prepare a simple meal, which they all shared around the campfire. Afterward, Mary put the exhausted children to bed, and the adults remained around the fire, discussing plans for rebuilding the barn. "Callahan won't stop," Frank Thompson said grimly. "He's wanted that water rights agreement for years, and he thinks he can scare me into signing it over." "We'll post guards," Sheriff Davis assured him. "And I'll telegraph the marshal in Kansas City. It's time Callahan faced real consequences." Eventually, the conversation died down and people began retiring for the night. Fiona had been offered a place in the house with Mary and the children, but she lingered by the fire, finding herself reluctant to leave Henry's company. "You should get some rest," he told her as the others drifted away. "You've done more than enough today." "So have you," she countered. "I saw you with Mary's wound. You have a healer's touch." Henry poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks into the night sky. "I learned field medicine during the war, Confederate Army, 12th Missouri Infantry." "You were a soldier," Fiona said softly, understanding dawning. "That's where you learned to treat injuries." He nodded, his expression distant. "Saw too much death. Tried to prevent what I could. After the war, I came back to independence and opened the store, but people still come to me when Doc Jenkins isn't available." "Why didn't you become a doctor officially?" Henry was quiet for a long moment. "I considered it, but after the war, I needed simplicity, predictability. The store provides that. And yet you rush out at all hours to help people in need," Fiona observed. "You may not have the title, but you have the heart of a healer." Their eyes met across the fire, and something unspoken passed between them. For a breathless moment, Fiona thought he might say more, but a sound in the darkness interrupted the moment. Henry was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. "Get inside," he ordered quietly. Fiona hesitated only briefly before hurrying toward the farmhouse. Behind her, she heard Henry alert the other men. They formed a defensive perimeter around the property, weapons at the ready. The minutes stretched endlessly as Fiona waited in the farmhouse with Mary and the children, all of them huddled in the central room. Outside, they could hear men's voices, occasionally raised in warning or challenge. When a shot rang out, Mary gasped, clutching her youngest child tighter. More shots followed, and Fiona moved to the window, peering cautiously through a crack in the curtains. In the moonlight, she could make out shadowy figures moving among the trees at the edge of the property. The defending men had taken cover behind wagons and outbuildings, returning fire when they had clear shots. The gunfight lasted perhaps 15 minutes, though it felt much longer. When silence finally fell, Fiona's heart pounded painfully as she waited for some sign of the outcome. A knock at the door made them all jump. "It's Henry," came the familiar voice. "It's safe now." Mary rushed to open the door and Henry stepped inside. He had a bloody gash on his arm but otherwise appeared unharmed. "Callahan and his men have retreated," he reported. "We winged a couple of them. They won't be back tonight at least." "You're hurt," Fiona said, moving toward him. "It's just a graze," he dismissed, though he didn't protest when she led him to a chair and began examining the wound. Mary brought water and clean cloths, and Fiona carefully cleaned the injury. "It needs stitches," she determined. "I can do it myself," Henry began, but Fiona shook her head. "Don't be ridiculous. I can sew quite well, and this isn't so different from mending a tear." Despite his protests, Henry submitted to her ministrations. Fiona worked carefully, her hands steady despite her racing heart. She was acutely aware of his eyes on her face as she concentrated, of the warmth of his skin beneath her fingers. "Where did you learn to stitch a wound?" he asked as she tied off the final suture. "My father fell on hard times before he died," Fiona explained, bandaging his arm. "We couldn't afford a doctor for minor injuries. I learned to make do." When she finished, their eyes met again, and this time Henry didn't look away. "Thank you," he said softly. "You've helped everyone else today," Fiona replied. "Someone should help you for a change." The journey back to Independence the next day was subdued. Sheriff Davis and 2 men remained at the Thompson farm for protection, while Henry, Fiona, and the others returned to town to gather more supplies and spread news of the attack. In the wagon, Henry and Fiona spoke little, both lost in their own thoughts. The events of the night had changed something between them, created a connection that neither seemed ready to acknowledge openly. As they approached town, Henry finally broke the silence. "You were very brave last night. Most people from the East would have fallen apart facing outlaws and gunfire." Fiona smiled slightly. "Perhaps you underestimate people from the East. We face different dangers, but we're not fragile." "No," he agreed, his eyes warm as they rested on her face. "You certainly are not." The following weeks brought change to Independence. News of the attack on the Thompson farm had galvanized the community, and many more men volunteered to stand guard at outlying properties. Sheriff Davis, emboldened by public support, sent telegrams to federal marshals requesting assistance in apprehending the Callahan gang. Winter descended early that year, bringing with it bitter cold and heavy snow. The schoolhouse, poorly insulated, became nearly impossible to heat adequately. After 2 weeks of children huddling in their coats and blowing on frozen fingers, Henry approached Fiona with a proposal. "The back room of the store is warm and spacious," he suggested. "You could hold classes there until spring." "That's very generous," Fiona replied, touched by his thoughtfulness. "But wouldn't it disrupt your business?" "Not significantly. Most of my customers come in the early morning or late afternoon. Your classes would be during the quieter hours." And so the arrangement began. Each morning, Fiona would arrive at Sawyer's General Store, and Henry would have the room prepared, tables and chairs arranged, the stove burning merrily. While she taught, he tended the store, occasionally slipping into the classroom to listen to a lesson or help a struggling student. It was during this time that Fiona began to truly understand the depth of Henry's character. He was unfailingly kind to the children, patient with even the most troublesome among them. He knew each child's circumstances, which families were struggling, which children needed extra attention. One snowy afternoon, as the children were filing out after class, Henry approached Fiona with a small wooden box. "I noticed Billy Matthews has no proper pencils," he said, opening the box to reveal a set of new drawing pencils. "He has talent. Seems a shame to waste it for lack of proper tools." Fiona was touched by his observation and generosity. "That's very thoughtful, Henry. He does have an artistic gift." "My father was a carpenter," Henry explained, running a finger over the smooth wooden case. "He taught me that talent without tools is like a seed without soil. It may have potential, but it needs the right environment to grow." "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was," Henry agreed, a shadow crossing his face. "I wish he could have seen what Independence has become." He was one of the first settlers here, back when it was just a few cabins and big dreams. This glimpse into Henry's past intrigued Fiona. She had learned bits and pieces about him over the months: his service in the war, his knowledge of medicine, his deep connection to the town, but much remained unknown. "Will you tell me more about your family sometime?" she asked. "I'd like to know." Henry studied her face, his expression softening. "I'd like that too. Perhaps you could join me for dinner this Sunday, at my home, not the boarding house." The invitation surprised and delighted her. "I'd be honored." Henry's home was a modest but well-built cabin on the outskirts of town, surrounded by pine trees and with a small creek running nearby. Inside, it was unexpectedly comfortable, with bookshelves lining one wall and a piano in the corner. "You play?" Fiona asked, surprised. "Not well," Henry admitted. "It was Catherine's. My wife," he added, though Fiona had already guessed. It was the first time he had mentioned his late wife directly to her. Fiona approached the piano, running a finger lightly over the keys. "It's beautiful and well-maintained." "Some things should be preserved," Henry said quietly. He moved to the fireplace, adjusting a log with a poker. "Dinner is almost ready. I hope you like venison stew." The meal was delicious, and conversation flowed easily between them. Henry spoke of his childhood in Independence, his father's work as both carpenter and frontier doctor, his own decision to join the Confederate Army despite his family's divided loyalties. "My brother fought for the Union," he revealed. "We didn't speak for years afterward. He lives in Oregon now. We write occasionally, but—" "The war left many such divisions," Fiona observed. "Even in Boston, families were torn apart by different loyalties." "And what of your family?" Henry asked. "You've mentioned your father's financial troubles, but little else." Fiona sipped her tea, considering how much to share. "My father was a textile merchant. He made unwise investments and lost everything when I was 17. He died of heart failure shortly after. My mother followed within a year, pneumonia officially, but I think it was really a broken heart." "I'm sorry," Henry said sincerely. "And you've been on your own since then." "I worked as a governess for a while, then as an assistant in a girls' school." Fiona's fingers tightened around her cup. "When that position ended, I had few options. A marriage was arranged with my father's former business partner, a man who had contributed to his downfall, though I couldn't prove it." "You didn't go through with it," Henry observed. "I saw the advertisement for a teacher in Independence the day before the wedding was to take place." Fiona smiled wryly. "I left a note, packed what I could carry, and took the first train west." Henry's expression was a mixture of admiration and concern. "That took courage, or desperation," Fiona countered. "Sometimes they look the same." After dinner, they sat before the fire, talking long into the evening. It felt natural, comfortable in a way Fiona hadn't experienced since before her parents' deaths. When she finally rose to leave, Henry walked her to the door. "Thank you for a lovely evening," she said, suddenly shy. "Fiona," he began, then hesitated. In the firelight, his eyes were warm and uncertain. "Would you allow me to call on you properly, not as the storekeeper or as a friend, but as a man with serious intentions?" Her heart beat faster. "Are you certain? I know there's been talk about you seeking a wife through correspondence." "That was before you came to Independence," Henry said firmly. "I placed that advertisement because I was lonely and because I believed I should marry again, but I never expected." He took her hand in his. "I never expected you." "Then yes," Fiona whispered. "I would like that very much." The courtship that followed was conducted with proper decorum but undeniable warmth. Henry called at the boarding house each Sunday, taking Fiona for walks or drives in his buggy. They attended church together, and sometimes spent quiet evenings at his home, reading aloud to each other or simply talking. As winter gradually gave way to spring, the schoolhouse was repaired and improved, with Henry overseeing much of the work himself. The children returned to their original classroom, but Fiona found herself missing the daily proximity to Henry that teaching at the store had provided. In early April, news reached Independence that federal marshals had captured Jake Callahan and most of his gang in a shootout near the Kansas border. The town celebrated with an impromptu dance in the newly completed community hall. Henry, looking handsome in a clean white shirt and dark coat, claimed Fiona for most of the dances. As they whirled around the floor, she caught the approving glances of many townsfolk, as well as the occasional raised eyebrow or whispered comment. Their courtship had become the subject of much speculation. "People are talking about us," she observed as they paused for refreshments. "Let them talk," Henry replied, unconcerned. "Independence thrives on gossip. Next week they'll find something else to discuss." But Fiona wasn't so sure. That evening, as Henry walked her back to the boarding house, Margaret Turner's disapproving figure was visible through the front window, watching their approach. "She doesn't approve," Fiona noted. Henry followed her gaze and sighed. "Mrs. Turner was a friend of Catherine's. She may feel I'm being disloyal." The mention of his late wife always created a moment of uncertainty between them. Though Henry had shared some details of his marriage, there remained an area of his life that seemed closed to Fiona. "Henry," she said carefully, "I understand your reluctance to speak of Catherine, but if we're to have a future together, I need to know about your past." He was silent for a long moment. "You're right," he finally acknowledged. "Will you walk with me tomorrow afternoon? There's somewhere I'd like to take you." The next day was Sunday, clear and mild. After church, Henry collected Fiona in his buggy and drove to the small cemetery on the hill overlooking Independence. There, beneath a maple tree, stood a simple headstone: Catherine Ann Lawson, 1842, 1870, beloved wife. "Until we meet again." Henry stood before the grave, his expression solemn but composed. "Catherine and I were childhood sweethearts. We married just before I left for the war. When I returned, we had 5 good years together." "What happened?" Fiona asked gently. "Childbirth," Henry replied, his voice tight with old grief. "She died bringing our son into the world. He lived only a few hours." Fiona's heart ached for him. "I'm so sorry, Henry." "For a long time, I blamed myself. I was the one with medical knowledge. I should have been able to save them." He shook his head. "It took years to accept that some things are beyond our control, beyond our power to change." Fiona took his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. "Is that why you never became a doctor officially?" "Because of what happened, partly," he admitted. "And partly because after losing them, I couldn't bear the thought of losing anyone else under my care." They stood in silence for a time, the spring breeze rustling through the young leaves above them. Finally, Henry turned to face her. "I loved Catherine with all my heart," he said simply. "I always will, but I've learned that the heart can expand to love again without diminishing what came before." He took both her hands in his. "I love you, Fiona Whitley, not as a replacement for what I lost, but as a new beginning, a different but equally precious love." Tears welled in Fiona's eyes. "I love you too, Henry." He kissed her then, a gentle, reverent kiss that held both acknowledgment of the past and promise for the future. In the weeks that followed, their courtship deepened. Henry spent evenings helping Fiona prepare lessons for her students, while she assisted him in organizing the store's inventory. They became partners in many ways before they officially became engaged. The proposal came on a warm evening in May. Henry had invited Fiona to dinner at his home, which had gradually transformed during their courtship. Catherine's piano remained, but now sheet music that Fiona enjoyed was stacked neatly atop it. Books they had discussed were prominently displayed on the shelves. Small touches reflected Fiona's presence and influence. After dinner, Henry led her to the back porch where they often sat watching the sunset. This evening, however, was different. Lanterns had been hung from tree branches, casting a golden glow over the yard. In the center stood a small table with a box upon it. "Henry?" Fiona questioned, looking around in wonder. He guided her to the table and opened the box. Inside lay a simple but elegant gold ring with a small pearl. "It was my mother's," he explained. "My father gave it to her when they decided to build a life together on the frontier." Kneeling before her, Henry took her hand. "Fiona Whitley, you came to independence seeking a new beginning, and in doing so you gave me one as well. Will you marry me? Will you build a life with me here, teach our children, grow old beside me?" "Yes," Fiona whispered, tears of joy streaming down her face. "Yes, with all my heart." They were married in the church on a perfect June day, with the entire town in attendance. Fiona wore a dress of ivory silk that Mrs. Winters had insisted on making as her gift. Henry looked impossibly handsome in a new suit, his face radiant with happiness as they exchanged their vows. The celebration afterward was held in the town square, with tables laden with food contributed by every family in Independence. There was music and dancing until well after dark, the community rejoicing not just in the union of two beloved citizens, but in the promise it represented for their town's future. As the party continued, Fiona found herself momentarily alone, watching Henry as he chatted with Sheriff Davis and Doc Jenkins. A voice at her elbow startled her. "They said you're looking for a wife," she whispered. Fiona turned to find Margaret Turner beside her, the older woman's eyes unexpectedly kind. "I beg your pardon. That's what I told you when you first arrived," Margaret explained. "When I mentioned that Henry had placed an advertisement for a mail-order bride. I said to you, they say he's looking for a wife." Fiona remembered the conversation now, a brief exchange at the boarding house during her first week in town. "I didn't realize you knew I was listening," she admitted. Margaret's lips curved in a knowing smile. "Not much happens in my boarding house that I don't notice, dear." She nodded toward Henry, who was now looking around for Fiona. "I saw the way he looked at you from the very beginning, and I heard what he said when you asked him about that advertisement. What did he say?" Fiona asked, curious now. "You asked if it was true he was seeking a wife. He looked you straight in the eye and said, 'I'm looking for you.'" Margaret patted Fiona's arm. "He didn't even realize he'd said it that way, but I heard it clear as day." Before Fiona could respond, Henry appeared at her side, slipping an arm around her waist. "There you are, Mrs. Lawson. I was beginning to think you'd run off with one of those young cowboys from the Henderson ranch." "Never," Fiona assured him, leaning into his embrace. "I found exactly who I was looking for." Later that night, as they walked hand in hand to Henry's now their home, Fiona recounted Margaret's story. "Did you really say that?" she asked. "That you were looking for me?" Henry considered this, then smiled. "I don't recall my exact words, but it would have been true regardless. All my life, I've been looking for you, Fiona. I just didn't know it until you stepped off that stagecoach." Their life together unfolded with both expected joys and unforeseen challenges. Fiona continued teaching for 2 years, until the birth of their first child, a son they named William, after Henry's father. She later returned to teaching part-time, bringing young William with her to the schoolhouse. Their daughter, Elizabeth, arrived 2 years later, followed by another son, James, the following year. Their home, once so quiet, now rang with children's laughter and the chaos of family life. Henry's reputation as both a storekeeper and a healer continued to grow. With Fiona's encouragement, he eventually agreed to formalize his medical training, studying with Doc Jenkins and through correspondence courses. When Jenkins retired, Henry divided his time between the store, which now employed 2 clerks, and a small medical practice. The town of Independence grew and prospered around them. The railroad came through in 1882, bringing new opportunities and connections to the wider world. Fiona established a proper school board and helped recruit additional teachers as the population increased. Through it all, their partnership remained the cornerstone of their lives. They faced hardships together: droughts that threatened local farms, a scarlet fever outbreak that claimed several young lives despite Henry's best efforts, economic downturns that strained the community. They also shared countless moments of joy: their children's milestones, community celebrations, quiet evenings on their porch watching the sun set over the land they both had come to love. On their 20th anniversary, their children, now young adults, arranged a surprise renewal of vows in the same church where they had first married. The ceremony was attended by many of the original wedding guests, along with a new generation of Independence residents. As they recited their vows once more, Henry and Fiona's eyes held the depth of shared experiences, of a love that had weathered time and trials. "I found more than a wife in you," Henry told her later, as they sat on their porch swing watching fireflies rise from the summer grass. "I found a partner, a healer for my wounded soul, a mother for our children, and a beating heart for our home." Fiona leaned her head on his shoulder, their hands intertwined as they had been that day at Catherine's grave so many years before. "And I found more than a husband. I found purpose, belonging, and a love I never thought possible." "Do you ever regret it?" Henry asked quietly. "Leaving Boston, coming to this wild place?" Fiona smiled, watching their youngest grandson toddle after a firefly in the yard, his older siblings calling encouragement. Beyond them, the lights of Independence twinkled in the gathering dusk, a testament to the community they had helped build and nurture. "Never," she said with absolute certainty. "This was always where I was meant to be, with you." As night fell fully, they remained on the porch, surrounded by the gentle sounds of a summer evening in the place they called home. Their journey from strangers to lovers to partners in all things had been unexpected, challenging, and ultimately more rewarding than either could have imagined, when fate first brought them together in a dusty frontier town. In the end, they had found not just each other, but themselves, their true purpose, their deepest capacity for love, and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. And it had all begun with a young woman's courage to seek a new beginning, and a man who recognized, upon seeing her, that his search was finally over.